Sometimes another writer writes a book you wish you'd written and it comes out a year after the book you're glad you wrote. Let me explain. June 1st this year was the 1-year anniversary of my last novel, Kingdom of the Wicked's successful publication. Normally, this is the sort of thing authors enjoy, especially given most books have the shelf life of yoghurt and finish up remaindered inside a year. Something about the popular response has been troubling me though, and I've finally been able to put my finger on it. This is thanks to reading Stephen D. Smith's Pagans and Christians in the City, Culture Wars from the Tiber to the Potomac. And I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that properly. Today's podcast is in response to two things. First, a request from a lot of people in the comments on my interview on Triggernometry requesting more Roman content on my channel. So here's some more Roman content. And second of all, it ties in with a review of Stephen D. Smith's book, Pagans and Christians in the City, which is being published by Law and Liberty, the same organisation that I did my Brexit explainer for. When that article comes out in the United States, Law and Liberty is an American organisation. I will, of course, put it up in the comments to this video underneath it in the links so that you can have a read of it because it isn't paywalled. Now, by way of background, for those of you who are new to my channel, Kingdom of the Wicked is a work of speculative fiction. It takes place in a Roman Empire that's undergone an industrial revolution. My initial academic training was in classics. I became a lawyer later to pay the bills. So I'm well aware pagan Rome had different cultural values from those now present in the modern industrialised West. I set out my vision for what I wanted to do in the book in a piece for the Cato Institute, and this essay is also published in the back of Book 1 of Kingdom of the Wicked. I tried to conceive of a world where a society unlike ours produces the progress and growth template all others then seek to follow. It's commonplace to point out that Roman civilization was polytheistic and animist, while ours is monotheistic but leavened by the Enlightenment, that Roman society was very martial, while Christianity has gifted us a tradition of religious and political pacifism, that Roman society had different views of sexual morality, marriage, and family structure. In short, I had to imagine an industrial revolution without monotheism. Basically, it had to look like the opposite of Victorian England and 18th century England. And I discovered, once the two books were published, both Book 1 and Book 2 of Kingdom of the Wicked, that if your book is popular, readers write to writers. If you ever become a successful novelist, you will have plenty of post. In days gone by, mine came by the good offices of Royal Mail and Australia Post. These days I still get a trickle in hard copy form, but most comes via Facebook, Twitter and email. Thanks to the contents of my author's post bag, two things became readily apparent within 6 months of Book 1 of Kingdom of the Wicked's publication. First, a lot of straight women wanted to shag one of my rather masculine Roman characters. The character in question is Cornelius, and he's the Roman equivalent of a principal crown prosecutor. He's a military prosecutor, so an army lawyer. And I admit, I sat there as I kept reading correspondence to this effect and thinking to myself, I've written 50 Shades for the Smart Set. Great, isn't that terrific? That's not quite what I expected, because I've got an established reputation as a literary author rather than a popular author, but then I'm only the author, and if people buy the book, I get paid. That's the way the system works. But separately from all the ladies, all the straight ladies who wanted to shag Cornelius, it became clear to me that a lot of people wanted to live in the world I'd created, and it was a slightly discomforting and awkward feeling. The Roman Empire was not the modern European Union, despite occupying much of the same territory. Its peoples looked like us, and its rulers spoke a language most of us can learn relatively easily, because Latin is the parent language of a large number of other languages, and there's lots of Latin in English, even though English is ultimately by origin a Germanic and Scandinavian language. Romans can seem like us, especially their flamboyant writers, lawyers, artists, generals and politicians. But apart from obvious distinctions, they had slavery, they had a taste for very cruel entertainment, and they also had saucy interior design, as anyone who has ever been to Pompeii and Herculaneum knows. They were also morally different from us all the way down. And this is what Pagans and Christians in the City, captures, and that's why it's well worth a read. Now, I gave my Romans modern science and technology partly to ensure a plausible alternative history. However, I also did it to head what I call P.J. O'Rourke objections off at the pass. In general, life is better than it ever has been, O'Rourke wrote in All the Trouble in the World. If you think that, in the past, there was some golden age of pleasure and plenty to which you would, if you were able, transport yourself, let me say one single word: dentistry. So I wrote a book with Roman morality and our dentistry, and broadly speaking, our technology. There are some differences, but broadly speaking, that the technological development is roughly similar to our own. Maybe a little bit earlier, maybe more the 80s. They don't have the internet, that kind of thing, and the people are extensively surveilled by the government. The government's quite nosy. Now, the Romans were very clean and took hygiene seriously and had a sort of primitive understanding of the way hygiene should work, which is why they were obsessed with bathing, why they knew how to sanitise the streets and sanitise water with quicklime rather than what we would use now, which is chlorine. But they still had the basic problem that all pre-industrial civilization had, which is that basically 4 in 10 children died before the age of 5 because they didn't have vaccines. We have completely forgotten what the world is like before vaccines, and that is why the modern anti-vax movement is completely balmy. The modern anti-vax movement is founded on forgetting what the world used to be like. So for all that the Romans were quite good at, once you'd reached adulthood, at sustaining life, and also they were good at reducing maternal mortality, partly because they valued the lives of adult women over the lives of their children, and that's a particular moral value. They were still just damaged extraordinarily by the fact that they didn't have vaccines, and you had so many child deaths. And one of the remarkable little details that crops up when you're doing Roman law is you discover that you couldn't, if your child died before the age of 2, have a proper tomb for it in a Roman columbarium, which was like their version of a pagoda because they burnt their dead. They were like Buddhists in Southeast Asia. And the reason for that is because so many children died before the age of 2. They weren't being cruel and nasty here. They could be cruel and nasty in other ways, but in this particular incident, it was sheer economics. It was, no, we don't have the pagoda space for people who die under the age of 2 because there are so many of them. That gives you an idea of the issue. So I did the modern technology to deal with that, to put it to one side. And Stephen Smith, in his book, captures this as well. He quotes Gibbon's very famous passage about the best part of human history was actually during the reign of the Antonine emperors. And of course, Gibbon was writing in the 18th century. He was an Enlightenment figure. And it's very important to remember that during the Enlightenment, this is before the development of vaccines, the deaths of children as a result of the absence of vaccines was probably at a higher rate than it was during the period of the Roman Empire, for the simple reason that the Romans were cleaner than we were. All those fancy wigs that people in the Enlightenment wore were all full of nets because they didn't wash their hair. So as a result of writing this type of book where I had Roman morality but our technology, the idea that I'd created some sort of ideal vision would not go away. However, it even turned up in serious reviews from reputable outlets, and I'm not going to dob anybody in, but they're not hard to find on the internet. People liked everything from the way I'd organised society to the role of the military to the system of governance to the stable, orderly rituals of Roman religion, to the way the health service was run. It's not based on the NHS, by the way, but it is universal. And there were times, I admit, as I kept getting correspondence along these lines and also reading reviews, that I wanted to shout, did you not notice the authoritarianism? Did you not notice the eugenics? Did you not notice the medical experiments on prisoners of war? Did you not notice the torture? A few people, mainly professional reviewers, noticed the torture. Kingdom of the Wicked is not a dystopia. I don't write them. The society it depicts works. Stephen D. Smith has therefore produced the book you need to read in order to understand how different was pagan morality from our own, and why I made the decisions I did as a writer of fiction. Recommending it to my readers, as I'm doing here, will save a lot of time going forward. The first half of Pagans and Christians in the City is given over to comparative religion. Smith outlines the underlying logic of Roman paganism and emergent, and it would have been Catholic, Christianity in the relevant period, and draws out similarities and differences. He discusses how paganism locates the sacred within the world. It's an immanent religiosity, whereby the divine emerges from the natural environment. Christianity and Islam, by contrast, are instances of transcendent religiosity. They place what is most sacred outside the world, in part because God made the world, The monotheistic creation story is very, very different from the pagan creation story that we have in a number of different paganisms, not just in Roman and Greek paganism, but also in Japanese Shinto and in Hinduism. Weirdly, the pagan conception of the origin of the earth is more compatible with modern science than monotheism, which is why you often get among modern scientists, if they're going to be religious at all, it'll be a spiritual kind of religiosity rather than Christianity or Islam, because the two really do fight over their origin stories. They're very, very different. Now, while classicists and scholars of comparative religion appreciate this distinction between immanent and transcendent religiosity, it's not widely known otherwise. And for my sins, because I originally trained in classics, I once spent a couple of years tutoring Latin, and I lost track of students pleading inquiries about what Romans actually believed. Their religious tradition was extremely diverse. In many ways, it was like Hinduism. You don't talk about Hinduism, the religion. You really should talk about Hinduisms, because there are so many different eccentric varieties of Hinduism in India, as anyone who's reasonably religiously educated in the history of Indian religion will explain to you very quickly. And I did things to my poor students, and I feel like a bad teacher even though this was like a long time ago. I resorted to suggestions like read Ovid's Metamorphoses while stoned, or go to Japan and get a priest or priestess to explain the significance of the great Ise shrine. So what Smith has done is very, very good here. He's actually sort of set out exactly what it is about Roman religion, about the sort of the bedrock of Roman religion, without trying to justify or explain all the different sub-varieties of it, which were very, very diverse. The other thing that Smith has done is that he's not done what I admit I did in Kingdom of the Wicked and in the essay for the Cato Institute and the one that appears in the back of Book 1 of Kingdom of the Wicked. He's not fallen back on theologically similar Shinto in Japan. Now, it is much easier if you're writing a book where people have a different conception of religiosity from the one that the readers are familiar with. If there is a living religion in the world you can pinch things from. And I freely admit I pinched things from Shinto. When there wasn't enough information about historical Roman religious practice, I substituted something from Shinto, because Shinto is a real modern religion. You can go to Japan, you can see it. Lots of Japanese people do some aspect of Shinto every single day. So what Smith has done here, without doing that, perhaps because he doesn't speak Japanese or hasn't been to Japan. I've been to Japan, and I also studied a Japanese martial art for many years. So I became pretty familiar with Japanese culture, and I even at one point spoke Japanese fairly well. So what Smith does is he takes Roman paganism seriously as a religious tradition on its own terms, and he renders it real and alive. You get a sense of what these people actually thought mattered. After he's done that, after he's done the comparative religion for you, you need to understand how these systems work. In the second half of his book, Pagans and Christians in the City, he sets out a bold claim. In short, he argues that paganism never went away. The imminent orientation to the sacred it advances is not only in direct competition with Christian transcendence, but competition between the two orientations continues today. It manifests in the US as culture wars because a number of progressive values comport readily with pagan conceptions of the sacred. This is particularly so when it comes to sex and sexuality. To take two of Smith's case studies among many, modern liberal democracies have simply abandoned the Christian, Jewish and Muslim view of same-sex attraction and abortion and substituted the pagan Roman view wholesale. Very, very briefly, the Romans gave 3/5 of fuck all cares about being what we would call being gay and about having an abortion. They just did not care. It was just morally insignificant to them. It wasn't even a case of people making a decision to say, well, we've decided that abortion should be legal in our country because otherwise people get back alley abortions, and then you don't just lose the fetus, you lose the mother as well, so on and so forth. They didn't even have that conversation. It just didn't occur to them to think that it was wrong. And this was so wide-ranging that Roman parents were actively encouraged by Roman law, if a child was born disabled or particularly ugly, which says something about their civilization, before it reached the age of 2, to kill it. And so they had power of life and death over their children while they were small. They grew up, obviously, if you kept the child alive, then the law would no longer protect you and you'd be charged with murder. But if the child was very small and it was disabled, then Roman parents were actively encouraged by Roman law to kill it. Although it wasn't compulsory, it was what you call liberal eugenics rather than state-sponsored eugenics. Sparta had state-sponsored eugenics, the Greek city-state, in the sense that the government came round and decided whether your child should live or die. The Romans weren't like that. It was just permitted to you if you wanted to do it. And I've captured this in a scene in Kingdom of the Wicked where Linnaeus, Yeshua ben Yusuf's lawyer, visits Petros, who is Yeshua ben Yusuf's most senior disciple, and this is obviously based on Jesus and Peter. And Petros has a little boy who has spina bifida, and Linnaeus reacts extremely badly because he's never seen a living child with spina bifida because he's from Rome, and in his country, anybody who finishes up with a child like that will just literally put it down like drowning unwanted kittens in the bathtub. So you're dealing with quite different morality here. And so what that means in his book, in Pagans and Christians in the City, is Smith has to explain just what it was that Roman pagans and the earliest Christians disliked about each other. And he's very even-handed the way he does this. So if you're Christian and you've been raised with the Romans picked on Christians and chucked them to the lions narrative, then Smith's account of just what early Christianity was like and how unpleasant many of its adherents were will really hit you in the face. You know, these were people who really did go around telling their neighbours and telling their friends that they were morally bad people for having an abortion or for being gay or for having sex outside of wedlock, and things that Romans just sort of generally didn't care very much about. I mean, a lot of Romans didn't even bother to marry. They just lived together. And the law protected them. They had an arrangement where that was a de facto relationship rather than de jure. And they had very, very liberal divorce laws. Women kept their property after divorce. So women who were, because they did have a double standard, women who were expected to be monogamous in a way that their husbands weren't, if they got sick of the husband, they could divorce him and they keep their property, particularly their dowry, which was most important. So it meant that women didn't finish up impoverished as a result of divorce, and it also meant that men didn't finish up wearing what is described as sexually transmitted debt by modern family lawyers. So that their family law was well designed and very liberal and quite modern, in some ways more modern than ours. So the Christians don't look particularly good. They come across as massive arseholes in Smith's book. But then you get, when he talks about the Romans, so if you're one of these fashionable humanists for whom Roman civil religion and civic nationalism, and these are things that are used to this day in our society, particularly in the symbols of many nations like the United States with its eagles and so on and so forth. So if you think civil religion and civic nationalism seem sophisticated and high-minded, you will learn how those fine ideals were drenched in blood, both animal and human. I mean, the Romans entertained themselves astonishingly cruelly. And they also, that awful entertainment, whilst they enjoyed it and got off on it, it was also seen as religious. It was like having lots of sex. It was part of their definition of piety. They thought it was sacred. It shows you that the basket of what is pious, different religious traditions put very different things in that basket. And the Romans put sex and entertainment in there in a way that we find completely staggering and very difficult to understand because our conception of morality is just very, very different. Smith gives fair play to both sides, and he also quotes, mainly in his footnotes, but also in the book itself, the mutual hatred between Christians and pagans. You would get things like, if Christians move into our street, house prices will go down, which sounds like something out of the Daily Mail. You would get Christians saying things like all pagan women are sluts and whores because they had more liberal sexual morality. And then you would get pagan responses like all Christian men are gutless cowards, in addition to being the fun police, because Christians were pacifists in the earliest days of Christianity and so they wouldn't serve in the military. And whilst the Romans didn't have conscription, serving in the legions was a very honourable and decent thing for a young citizen man to do. And if you refused to do it, you were considered, to use the modern term that people in the alt-right use, but it is quite a funny term, you were considered a bit of a cuck. And so the early Christians were basically called cucks by their pagan neighbours, the men especially, they were considered to be gutless. And then at various times when people take power, both Christian and pagan, they do things like pass legislation to exclude their religious opponents from the labour market. So Christians don't have rights of appearance before the courts, and then pagans don't have rights of appearance before the courts, and so on and so forth. And then it gets to a really serious point in the sort of 3rd and 4th century AD, where you literally get governments of both stripes saying we're going to kill you and destroy everything you hold dear. Really, really destructive. Both sides were equally culpable, albeit in different periods. It depended which lot had their hands on the levers of power. Now, this is where Smith gets interesting. I'm not sure whether he's right, but it's a fascinating story and the book is worth reading just for this. Embedded in his historical account is a further claim The modern city, as in our cities and civilization now, isn't big enough for both of them. That is, when immanent and transcendent conceptions of the sacred are forced to share the same piece of real estate, they come into conflict. Each will try to seize the levers of power and enact laws to help their side and hinder the opposition. And you sort of sit there and you look at it and you think, well, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? And part of what Smith does when he describes these two different conceptions of the sacred and these two different religious traditions that are just incapable of leaving the other lot alone is he gives a really interesting scientific account of the psychological needs that produce religion. And these are human constants, and they're almost certainly biologically hardwired and must be met. Religion facilitates the human desire to make meaning, effect control, and form regularised communities. Importantly, however, it doesn't have to be either transcendent or immanent religiosity to achieve those things. It just has to be religion. So basically being religious is part of being human, which comes as a bit of a shock to the system for people who are sort of intuitive and natural atheists. And Smith discusses one. He uses a legal colleague in the book to give an example of this. And I have to admit, I'm one as well. I'm just the most non-sacred person ever. I've never been able to get my head around why people get wound up in all this silly nonsense. And it doesn't matter what sort of religiosity it is, whether it's pagan or Christian, I just don't sort of really get it. And it's fascinating the way he builds this picture up, because people like me are really quite rare in the human population. We struggle to understand the extent to which minding other people's morality is deeply human, whether it's Christian or pagan. Yeah, religion just turns up everywhere. It's a cosmic, homeopathic joke with only memories of being funny. But is it true, though? Is there really a resurgent modern variation of Roman paganism present in developed liberal democracies, including the United States? Remember, Smith is American. He's a professor of law at the University of San Diego in the United States. So he talks a lot about the history of the United States and particularly litigation in the United States because he's a lawyer and he's interested in that. Now, I'm not interested in what classicists tend to call fluff wicker. That is, people like me who have a classical training take a really dim view of the Druids who prance around Stonehenge every summer solstice, and we tend not to be impressed by Morris dancers with blue hair that turn up on English market days. It's not really paganism, it's artificial paganism. It's got tiny bits of historic paganism in it, but the rest of it's basically made up, often in the 18th and 19th century. And my response to Smith is no, despite my admiration for pagans and Christians in the city. Roman paganism is just too different from what we now see across the developed world. And this is something that Smith manages to convey precisely because he takes the historic religion seriously. The book's worth reading just for that. Yes, he advances plausible claims for an orientation overlap, and his account of recent US litigation over religious symbols suggests progressivism can exhibit pagan religious qualities. Modern scientific secularism also aids immanence and not transcendence. There is only one world, and it's the only one we have. But even secularism can only do so much. While it may be true that the US's rising cohort of nuns, as they call them on the census, are not atheists in the strict sense, they're also not yet pagans, and this is particularly notable because they're just not organised, and the ones that are organised are this fluff wicker variety of paganism that classicists tend to find very funny and very silly. This is, of course, with the exception of environmentalism, and this is something I've written about in The Spectator. I am loath to be the reviewer who advises authors to write even partly different books. I think this is a bad idea, and a lot of reviewers do it, and it's a bit dodgy, so I'll just flag this up as it's me being a bit dodgy, but the point has to be made because I have written about this issue for The Spectator. But had Smith focused on the Green Movement as immanent Roman paganism, he'd have come close to making out the strong form of his case. You would have to be blind to have not noticed the extent to which activists outfit Extinction Rebellion, advances, autistic savant Greta Thunberg as a type of child seer. You would have to be very silly and very unaware of the history of the environment movement to not know about James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, which is kind of a blend of science and paganism, because Roman paganism in particular comports more readily with science, particularly the evolutionary account of the emergence of life on Earth, because it's located in the natural environment and it's not external to it. But it's very clear that environmentalism blends that immanent pagan orientation But this blend is with millenarian Christianity, and millenarianism is a type of Christianity that says the world is going to end at a defined point, usually within 1,000 years, hence the word millenarian. So they've got a mixture of the two in there. They've nicked something from Christianity and they've nicked something from paganism, and it does look a lot like religion. Now, immanence is an altered sensibility. It is a different way of thinking, and if you had any participation in the Green Movement in even the shallowest way, you would know this. It's not only Roman, as I said, the Japanese have it, and so do strands of Hinduism, and so does Chinese folk religion. Certainly it's not particularly Christian or Muslim. It's very, very distinct. It doesn't mean that that sensibility is worse, necessarily, but it does mean different, and you have to wrap your head around that. And the thing I have tried to capture in Kingdom of the Wicked is the extent to which there's a degree of path dependence to both orientations when they become dominant. Monotheistic transcendence can produce particular horrors, and we all know what they are. The wars of religion, the terrible treatment of gay people across all of the monotheistic traditions, and the Jews and the Christians have only stopped doing it recently because they tend to live in secular states. I mean, historically, gays were burnt at the stake, whereas Muslims hang them from cranes or stone them to death. And historically, Jews stoned them to death, and the Romans were horrified by this and tried to stop it. And of course, you get the very different approach to abortion, although once again, some Christians and some Jews and some Muslims have started to move away from that now, but not all of them. Historically, they certainly didn't, and all three of those religious conceptions thought it was very wrong. So that's a particular sort of set of horrors that have had really nasty knock-on effects. I mean, the 30 Years' War probably wiped out a third of the German population, and before the Treaty of Westphalia, it probably laid half of the country to waste. I mean, this is a very, very serious issue. Now, paganism produces different horrors, and this is what I've tried to catch in Kingdom of the Wicked. So you don't have Magdalene asylums, and you don't have women having to give up their babies to be adopted where they get sexually abused and that kind of thing. It's just never going to happen in this society because they don't care about abortion. It just doesn't matter to them. But they do things like eugenics. Because they have a more porous boundary between human beings and animals, they recognise that there is nothing particularly special about humans. There's no special creation in paganism. We're just another type of animal. It's much easier to tolerate things like human experimentation. And I mean, this is documented historically. Galen, the most competent of Roman lawyers, and the man who came up with anaesthetic, which was then rediscovered by James Young Simpson at the University of Edinburgh, he was a doctor of the gladiators, and one of the reasons why he was so good was because he saw lots of chopped up bodies, as you would expect. Now, he finished up a doctor to one of the Roman emperors, but he got competent by either chopping up himself or seeing lots of chopped up bodies as a result of being a doctor to the gladiators. That gives you an idea of how differently the conception of what is human and what is not human can be in these two different religious traditions. And the other thing is, of course, is the Romans didn't think people were equal. And I addressed this in my very first podcast on Kingdom of the Wicked. Moral inequality of persons was absolutely baked into paganism. If you were beautiful, if you were clever, if you were brave, the classic Helen, Ulysses, and Achilles of Homer, if you had those qualities, they meant that you were favoured by the gods and you got better treatment in Roman society, and people thought that that made you a better person. These also existed in Greek society as well, even though they were much more sexist than the Romans. We have documented incidents where a woman was accused of murder and she was very, very beautiful, and she got in front of the all-male jury in Athens and quite literally just dropped her clothes and said, "Do you think the gods would make me a bad person?" basically, because she was so beautiful. And the jury just all went, "Oh, well, okay, fair enough, acquit." This kind of thing happened. Okay, so what Romans and Greeks responded to was morally quite different from what we respond to. And they certainly didn't respond well to stories of victimhood or suffering. It had to be in a very, very specific context. For example, when Cicero wanted a jury, and remember, of course, by the time you get to the Romans, you have female jurors and the status of women is much higher. When he wanted to get a jury, a Roman jury, in this case, jury of 15, like they are up in Scotland, to feel sorry for people, he was very careful to get a female slave and put her in front of the jury, and she'd been flogged terribly and had terrible scars on her back, and said, "This is not the way you treat female slaves. This is wildly inappropriate." But it did help him that the female slave, in particular, it was during the Verres trial, was beautiful. This is just a characteristic of Roman society. You know, why would you damage something beautiful, you nasty pissant? You're a bad slave owner. Not because slavery is wrong or because cruelty is wrong. Romans were often very cruel, but because you shouldn't do that to something that is beautiful because you're damaging something that's favoured by the gods, even if that person is a slave. So I really enjoyed Stephen Smith's Pagans and Christians in the City. If you're American, the history of US religious litigation is absolutely fascinating, and I learnt an enormous amount from it. But the most useful thing in the book is the way it captures Roman religion and captures the bedrock of it, the underlying logic of Roman religion. And for all of those people who wrote to me, and I'm sure I'll get more letters along this line, with respect to Kingdom of the Wicked and wanting to live there, that's fine. Paganism has many fine qualities, and Smith acknowledges this. But I also suggest, in addition to reading what I wrote, read something like Pagans and Christians in the City, so you just understand how different this conception of religion is, and also how pervasive it is, how it exists in our society as well, just in a subdued sort of way, and particularly, as I say, although Smith doesn't address this directly, in certain aspects of the environment movement. Caring for the environment is good, this is a good quality, but it also evinces a different religious orientation, and you might want to take that seriously. So as I say in my piece for Law and Liberty, if you want to live in the world I made in Kingdom of the Wicked, may I suggest you read Pagans and Christians in the City just to make sure. Be careful what you wish for, and all that.